Hello, Mr. Ismailov. I'm sure we'll have a very interesting and open conversation. The theme will be somewhat unexpected. The International Telecommunication Union is an old, well-established organization, but we don't hear about it every day on the news. What does it do? Why is it important right now? And what is its mission?
It's a specialised agency of the United Nations. As for its popularity, I've recently read an article in the New York Times where I was also mentioned, and it said, "This is the most important organisation nobody knows of." It is an international communication technologies union that develops standards, assigns frequencies, basically everything we do today. The union deals with these issues at the government level. There are other specialised organisations in communication technologies at the corporate or institutional level, but nations are represented only in the International Telecommunication Union. All aspects of modern development, the fourth industrial revolution, information and communication technology, digitalisation, etc., are incorporated in the International Telecommunication Union. This organisation's history is rich. It is almost 160 years old, 156 to be exact. Russia was one of the co-founders of the International Telegraph Union with the headquarters in Geneva. Like I said, it is a specialised UN agency that is going to play a key role in the new economic reality, which is a prerequisite for new social relations.
It seems like a highly specialized organization should stay away from politics. Is it influenced by geopolitical tension?
It always has been, I think. Space was the first major factor that influenced the organisation in a big way. Space was open, it belonged to everyone, and to no one in particular. We needed to have an agency that would supervise everything that was happening with the orbit and space communication by establishing operational guidelines. I think right now we are experiencing the second major crisis. The ITU has always tried to stay away from politics and focus on highly specialised communications issues. But as the internet started to gain ground, we began to see more politics. If I am elected, I will strive to avoid this politicisation. I want to make sure that the organisation focuses more on its actual objectives, frequencies, standardisation, etc. Of course, this won't be totally possible because technology is now an integral part of our everyday life, including geopolitics. We are seeing this with the sanctions that are being imposed.
Russia is being pressured in all international organizations. Some want to strip it of its voting rights. Others want to expel Russia.
When we celebrated the ITU's 150th anniversary, we chose 5 contemporaries who had contributed the most to the organisation. One of them was Mark Krivoshev, a Russian national. Sadly, he died 3 years ago. Digital television basically started with him, and the whole world recognises that. He developed all the standards and norms for digital television. After the special military operation started, we've had 2 major events. The World Telecommunications Standardization Assembly was the first one. A lot of specialists and experts from Russia were part of working groups, committees. Many have prominent roles. Representatives of, you can guess which countries, proposed a resolution that banned all our specialists from this work and leadership positions. It's been a long-standing ITU tradition to make consensus-based decisions. Even the most complicated things, like frequencies, geo-orbital positions, information security issues, etc., were decided based on the consensus, without a vote. I think this was the first assembly with a vote. I think we would have seen a very different result had this vote been secret. With the open vote, there was unprecedented pressure, especially on third world countries. And they passed a resolution about banning all Russian candidates from everything. This came as a shock to me, of course, because I've been with the ITU for quite a while. I've headed up the Russian delegation at many events. Even in 2014 to 15, when the pressure was already significant, it didn't come to this. Now it has come to this. It is done in blatant violation of Article 3 of the International Telecommunication Union's Constitution, the charter that prohibits any kind of discrimination based on nationality in the ITU's governing bodies. But it happened. The second notable event was the ITU Council. The structure is similar to the general UN structure. It's not the Security Council per se, but out of the 193 member states, only 48 are present at the ITU Council. Our delegation was able to stop a very harsh resolution. If it had been passed, Russians would not have been allowed to participate in the September election campaign. There are 2 of us. I will be running for the Secretary General office, and my colleague will be trying to get elected into the Radio Regulations Board at the Plenipotentiary Conference. This is also a very important office, which consists of 12 members. It is basically international arbitration on frequencies, interference, and other important issues related to radio broadcasting. But the resolution didn't pass. The initiators ended up drawing up another draft, which wasn't as harsh. Russia is represented by world-class experts who work in the organisation. Their expertise is mostly in the theoretical field, thanks to our unique system of education. I know that these were top professionals. I can see that even by looking at the universities that they graduated from. They are respected experts with 20 plus years of experience. Their colleagues later came up to them in private and said, "It's not our fault, this wasn't our idea, but we had to."
Show solidarity.
It wasn't solidarity. They were forced to do it. Many said that they were forced to take that step and vote in a certain way. A significant number of countries voted against it or abstained.
Over 190 members. In essence, it is a global election. Why do you think you would be a good leader in this organization?
Am I supposed to praise myself now? Self-PR?
Well, you do have something to offer, right? You do need to impress people who will vote for or against you.
A lot depends on the country and its influence or reputation. The candidate himself also matters, of course. My experience is very diverse and I've been successful in almost everything I've done. I spent around 20 years in major multinational corporations, the largest manufacturers of telecom equipment. Ericsson, Nokia, Huawei and Nokia again. For almost 6 years I worked as a Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Telecom and Mass Communications of the Russian Federation, where I coordinated the IT and International Department. The international aspect took up most of my time. In this sense, the Ministry represented Russia's interests in the two largest international organisations, the International Telecommunication Union and the Universal Postal Union. Its headquarters is also in Switzerland, in Bern. I headed up our delegation for 6 years. My experience has been with various multinational corporations, European and American, which Nokia eventually became, as well as Chinese. I think I was the first non-Chinese VP in the history of Huawei or any Chinese company. It was a unique experience since I only know about China from books, and now I was able to learn through my colleagues and my work. I was a government official and the head of our ITU delegation at the same time. The pinnacle of my career was when I chaired the ITU Council, and I think I was pretty good at that job. I was able to bring India and Pakistan to the table, two countries with very complicated relations, and help them reach a consensus. This was my triumph when India and Pakistan agreed to the proposals that were on the table. Pakistan finally gave the green light to the ITU area office in India. For many years prior to that, Pakistan had been blocking this initiative, and under my leadership it finally agreed. So I have experience working at the state level. I left the government almost 4 years ago and started preparing for this office, but not as a regulator, this time, or someone who works at the global level in the ITU. I was thinking more about working on the ground. After leaving the ministry, I was head of Nokia in Russia. I left after 1 year to work for a startup because I wanted to see what it was like. I wanted to learn more about software. This is internet software, but this was also a state project, which is to be finished in a short period of time. 2 years ago, I was invited to Beeline, which is one of the leading providers. I was asked to be president. My objective, among others, is to oversee government regulations, information security, and interaction with government agencies. Beeline is part of the massive VEON group. It is present in 9 countries. I believe it is one of the largest providers working all over the world. Thanks to my VEON connections, I continued working with regulations in the context of the GSMA, Global System for Mobile Communications. I am on the policy board at the association, which deals with regulation policies and government-related issues. With all this diverse expertise, as well as my thorough knowledge of the ITU, not just as an official that used to work there, but as someone who headed up a delegation and chaired the ITU Council, participated in working groups, etc., I feel I am well equipped for implementing all my ideas.
Can your association with government structures and your experience of public service be a negative factor in this respect?
It all depends on how you look at it. It can be a positive or negative factor. When my candidacy was announced, several Western media publications, the New York Times in particular, emphasised my record as a public official and, oddly enough, my work with Huawei, although I spent much more time at Ericsson than I did at Huawei and the ministry combined, over at least about the same amount of time. It's possible that everyone expects some political bias on my part, but if you consider my complementary experience, my corporate and business record, it's almost fivefold the time I spent in public service. But I don't want to disavow my government experience. It was absolutely unique. And I am sure that it's good for any businessman, a top manager in particular, and that's exactly what we see happening in the US. The Americans are our most vocal critics, but you see, it is common practice in the US for consulting agents to move on to work for the state, then join a big corporation, and finally give lectures at an Ivy League university. So I don't see it as an obstacle.
Are Americans perhaps allergic to everyone who has anything to do with Huawei?
I don't understand why this has happened. Huawei was demonized, accused of all manner of offences. I think it may have been done out of fear of competition. Huawei is a strong competitor. When I joined the company in 2010, they told me two corporate legends about Huawei. The first one was about the time when their main building was constructed. Back in the day, Huawei focused on resoldering traditional PBX plates for telecommunication switchboards. As the legend goes, when the foundation for Huawei's main building was being laid, the company's founder, Ren Zhengfei, said they needed to have as many underground levels as the stories above the ground. He said they would need a garage. Nobody believed him back then, as the staff mainly came to work on bikes, wearing coarse canvas trousers. But it turned out he was right. Huawei demonstrated, and its rapid growth, and its all positive aggression. I think the rise of Huawei made Americans so sad because its appearance on the market caused some of the biggest telecom companies to vanish. I'm talking about Nortel, Lucent, and Motorola. Three of the biggest North American telecom companies. Nortel is based in Canada, while Lucent and Motorola are American century-old businesses which had the most brilliant inventors working for them. And they all disappeared into other companies as a result of mergers and acquisitions. Ericsson bought Nortel, and Lucent and Motorola ended up with Nokia. That's it. And it has to be noted that the European telecom vendors, Ericsson and Nokia, survived. I believe this explains America's dislike of Huawei. Unlike many other countries, the US has always been anxious to protect its telecom market and digital sovereignty, more so than any other country. I believe they were simply afraid of this new, dynamically growing Chinese vendor.
Tell me about your program of information and communications technology humanization. What is it all about? Who is it for? And what are the goals of this program?
At the very start of the 21st century, I used to be an earnest supporter of the cyber-communist ideology. I read a book by Dr. Richard Barbrook, an opinion leader and prophet of cyber-communism. This concept was not about building a new digital gulag. It's about the internet as a free space, free medium, something that was invented by a scientific community. Because it all started as a computer network that linked together researchers and universities. The internet ushered in a new era. It's as important as Gutenberg's invention, printing. It is of crucial importance to the prosperity and well-being of humanity in the 21st century. But in reality, the result of this digitalization was that man as a human being was forgotten. In this race for technological advance, all the humane and social aspect of human life started to be increasingly neglected. That's why I called my program 5 Steps Towards ICT Humanization. The recent events in particular have shown, and I'm surely not the only one to have noticed this, there are plenty of publications saying the same thing, that humankind is headed in the wrong direction. Instead of building a digital paradise, or cyber-communism, as they said in the early 20th century, we are building a digital gulag, a digital concentration camp. What I'm trying to do here is reverse the situation and persuade the global community that humanitarian aspects of our life need to prevail. It shouldn't be technology for the sake of technology. Digitalization can't be the ultimate goal, when everyone is digitalized like pigeons with rings on their feet and that's it. When in fact, ICT and digitalization can offer amazing opportunities for achieving, if not prosperity, but progress for sure. Progress cannot be stopped.
And what about digital rights of individuals? Is protection of these rights a sensitive issue?
We're not the first to talk about individual digital rights. Once you mention this subject, they immediately start hurling accusations at you of being reactionary, opposing progress, and willing to get humanity back to the medieval era.
Why?
There are a lot of aspects to this problem. The individual is just one of the aspects in the current struggle for humanization. There are no rules that regulate this area. Global corporations enjoy absolute freedom, bordering on arbitrariness, in the way that they conduct affairs, pursuing their business interests and prioritising profits. This often contradicts the national interests of a state, threatens its sovereignty, and as a result the freedom and rights of individuals. And we were not the first to start talking about this. This issue was first raised in the European Union when they adopted the GDPR. And there are a lot of lawsuits targeting large internet and ICT companies. Apple and Facebook faced lawsuits too. You remember this, I'm sure. The trailblazer was the EU, not Russia. We arrived there a little later, in fact, but now we are there too. I believe the countries launched this process after seeing their sovereignty and the sovereignty of their citizens threatened. And this interdependence engendered opposition and brought this issue to the international agenda.
And I thought that the state and individuals or users of technology are on different sides of the trench in some aspects. Am I wrong?
This largely depends on the policies pursued by the state. And this issue is indeed a tangle of contradictions. It's not even a dichotomy or a trichotomy. There are three sides to the problem, each promoting its own interests. Scientific community, businesses, and the state trying to protect its sovereignty. And the cornerstone in this struggle is the internet, as it provides an important platform where everything happens. Russia has always supported the idea of drafting an international legal framework, and the most recent developments, especially the sanctions Russia's ICT sector has been slapped with, prove that we were right. The ILF would provide a global set of rules, not only in the economic or technical aspect, but also, and Russia has repeatedly stressed the point, the ethical component of all ICT-related issues. An ILF would serve as a legal guarantee protecting us against the most outrageous things. We have already been there, in fact. Comparing the current situation to various historical periods, we could find similarities with the 1940s or 1950s or even 1960s, when there was a nuclear threat.
Right. That's what I wanted to ask. How did it happen that, given our long history of dealing with such pressing issues, the game rules have never been worked out?
There are rules, but they are all kind of palliative. The reason why clear-cut rules have never been adopted is the United States, which is an absolute leader in this field. The American dominance is waning, perhaps, but it's still there and it's overpowering. However, the world's other large economies are doing their best to minimise the risks here, and the US dominance is secured by big corporations based in that country and operating from there. Every time someone is trying to ask this question, they are accused of attempting to stifle democracy and the freedom of speech, to set up a firewall, introduce censorship, and so on and so forth. But this wouldn't stop the discussion. In fact, it can go on forever. You can clearly see the two camps humankind is divided into. Developing countries in the West. Something was done in the past, of course. There was some progress on this track. But on the other hand, what happened to Russia over the past months effectively cancels out all the progress. There were certain apprehensions in the past when we were told that we already had all the basic platforms and technology we could need one day, sooner or later, if caught in a dire situation. And these fears came true. Back in the 1940s to 60s, the situation played out differently. First, the Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons, then China followed suit. And this offset everyone's ambitions, made the perception of risk very tangible. We didn't have that in the ICT field for quite a long time. Unfortunately, instead of integrating technologies and benefiting from this synthesis, because you see, Russia has technological sovereignty too, even if it's limited. I mean, we have invented some products, that's not to mention China, and Europe too has technologies of its own. But unfortunately, everything has gone wrong and we have been unable to reach an agreement.
One of your program's features is equal and universal access to the internet, which makes me wonder, isn't this something we already have?
No, we don't have equal access to the internet for everyone. What we do have is all the signs of neocolonialism. They do exist. There is still no equal access in many African countries. They don't have it because they don't have electricity. It's as simple as that. In India, the number of rural residents not having access to the internet is enormous. There is also what the UN calls the North-South problem. This concept traditionally presents the South as backward and the North as developed and advanced. But Russia offers another version, or gestalt, of this problem, where the South and North change places. The Russian North has vast uninhabited territories, many remote villages that hardly even have electricity, not to mention the internet or any other such conveniences, is the backward South. This is what the problem of equal access is all about. This problem stems from global inequality in a broader sense, from the privileges enjoyed by the so-called golden billion, even here in Russia. From pointillism, to use an artistic metaphor, in the way the blessings of civilization are distributed in both developed and developing countries. There are clusters, or enclaves, remembering the famous book series by Vadim Panov, where all the comforts are concentrated. In Brazil, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo are two examples of such enclaves. They have everything that modern digital civilization has to offer, including all types of access. But go to a village in Amazonia and you'll see they don't have all this. So the problem we are talking about stems from equality on a global scale, a global lack of access to digital services for a significant part of the world's population.
Russia is developing alternatives to the biggest Western social media platforms. The West is banning our media outlets. RT was hit hard, for example. Is this a case of double standards in terms of freedom of information? To me, it seems that the topic is especially relevant today.
It is not really my subject since I don't work in media. I am a communications man first of all, with a little bit of IT knowledge. We've seen these double standards before, but Russia has managed to partially cover its needs with national services. Social media, for example. We've got VKontakte. As far as I know, it is even more popular and has a bigger audience than the CIS compared to Facebook. We also have a major digital platform, Yandex, and most importantly, we don't use them to gain technological advantage. We allow anybody to use them. When it comes to media channels, yes, YouTube belongs to Google, right?
Right.
Yes, I know it's been happening recently. It's called cancel culture. They just cut you off and pretend you were not there. They use it to promote their own opinions. Their vision is the only option without any alternatives. This is a totalitarian approach, and it didn't start with RT. We've seen it before. They encouraged extremist resources on their platforms. At the same time, they eradicated anyone who goes against their agenda. A good example is the cancelling of Donald Trump, who was elected president at the time, the ruler of the shining city on a hill.
Trump had it much easier than we do today.
Still, he got cancelled. It may have something to do with the fact that the majority of big tech supports the Democrats, but still it was an outrage. Nobody could have thought it would come to this, that the entire internet community could cancel the leader of the world's most powerful country by simply pressing a button.
Do I understand it correctly that the ITU has a very peculiar division when it comes to regions? The entirety of the Western Hemisphere, for example, is a single region.
That is true.
Is that region dominated by the US, and why is the world divided like this, by the way?
I don't know, there must be some historical reasons. When I became part of the organisation, the division was already there. There are several regional offices, Arab states for example, that span several continents. There is a small part of Europe, there is Asia, the Middle East and Northern Africa. There is the Asia-Pacific region, there is a CIS office that includes all former Soviet republics. CIS telecommunication companies established it in 1991 without any prior arrangement. There is a regional office for the Americas, both North and South. The US dominated the region for a long time, but the world isn't static, and there was an awakening when Latin American nations realised their sovereign interests were often different from those of the US. Brazil, the largest country, is the undisputable leader of the region. Culturally, Latin America is unique. It's an amalgam of the Catholic, Hispanic and Portugal cultures. The continent is unique in this sense. Garcia Marquez, Jorge Luis Borges, Jorge Amado, these are world-famous names. At the same time, local establishment doesn't want to play second fiddle to the US. This process started back in the early 20th century and isn't going to stop anytime soon. They challenged the ultimate domination of the US, technologically as well as politically. I think extraordinary breakthroughs in ICT can take place in Latin America. Just look at Brazil. It is considered democracy is a much more pressing issue there because Latin Americans are more passionate, maybe, than sovereignty. Democracy, with respect to the thing you've told me about cancel culture and domination, is felt much stronger there than in other parts of the world. Brazil is the uncontested leader in open source software. Open source is a manifestation of democracy in ICT, and Brazil is at the forefront here. There are several other countries that push LATAM agenda, but historically the Americas are considered a single region. To some extent because they gradually flow from completely Anglo-Saxon Canada to the US, which is more Hispanic the further south you go, to the Caribbean basin, Mexico and all the way down to Latin America, called Ibero-America for a reason. Deep down there is another controversy. For them, democracy is more important than sovereignty. These people had many revolutions in the 20th century. The Cuban Revolution, for example. Traditions of social justice and standing up to oppression are strong there. They have this in common with Russians to some extent. Social justice is critical to them. They do not tolerate oppression and is already affecting the operations of CTEL, the American Regional Organization.
Where is the seat of power today, and what can you say about the Asia-Pacific region in this respect?
The US is still the dominating force. We can say whatever we like, but the big tech and core technology is still there. The world is changing though. In 2014 I was somewhat happy the sanctions were introduced and we had a chance to at least do something on our own. The same is true for them. There are some outstandingly developed countries, Japan and South Korea, but there is also China. It plays a major role in the region. It is a leading power there, and again there is India. It may look like these are flying under the radar, but there are giants there like Huawei, ZTE, Baidu or Alibaba. But India is a curious country, and I think it could have its breakthroughs in ICT. India also wants more sovereignty. It is inevitable because India has one of the largest populations in the world, surpassing even China if I'm not mistaken. The region is a patchwork. Some territories gravitate towards China, some towards India and some towards both countries. It is home to the world's most populous nations. Vietnam has almost 100 million people. Thailand has 50 million. There is also Cambodia and Laos. It is a giant subcontinent. There are also Anglo-Saxon countries, New Zealand and Australia. They have their own way, more in line with the Western development paradigm. It is hard to describe the region. When it comes to technology, these countries develop rapidly. Japan has experienced a certain slowdown in ICT, but South Korea, India and China are booming. And again, this is the region with the largest population. It is increasingly becoming the centre of the world. And I am not even going to mention countries like Pakistan and Indonesia. Both have great ICT aspirations, and that is only natural. Pakistan is the first Islamic nuclear power. This must say something about its ambition. Indonesia has 250 million people. This quantity will become quality one day, the more they focus on sovereignty, which implies independent elementary and higher education, as well as emergence of national middle and upper class. This is where it will eventually lead.
Mr. Ismailov, you have said North Africa and the Middle East are part of an Arab region. In geopolitics, it is not simply a mosaic of interests, but also a real rivalry and disputes. Is it the same in ICT?
These are Arab countries, with an addition of Israel. Israel is part of the Middle East geographically, but has uneasy relations with its neighbours. Fortunately, they have been improving lately. The diplomatic relations were established, for example, and the Arab world isn't homogeneous as well. It is divided into Mashriq and Maghreb. In Maghreb, in turn, there are also tensions between Algeria and Morocco.
They're under different influences.
Yes, in the colonial era, some were under French influence and others under British. But I grew up in an Arab country. My father was working in the region, and I have also spent many years there. I am also a Muslim, so Arab language and culture have a special place in my life. When I was a child, I wanted to study the Quran, and I knew the Arab world really well. Back in the day, there was the Afro-Asian People's Solidarity Organisation, and I had a classmate whose father worked for it. It had its HQ in Egypt, so I know that country well since childhood, as well as other Arab countries of North Africa. We often describe Latin America, Asia and Africa as developing civilizations, implying they have a lot to catch up to. But the truth is they are the oldest civilizations. They emerged in Africa and in the Arab world. As my father used to say, the problem with Arab nations is their lack of unity. They don't have a common agenda, and their internal disagreements prevent them from accumulating the enormous resources they have to make a huge leap, both economically and in terms of ICT. Poor and rich Arab nations all have certain conflicts or disagreements, and this characteristic of the Arab world, it has many colours. Many factors are at work here, making it really appealing on the one hand, but on the other hand, politically you understand that there is the Arab League. There are other associations, our local groups, and lately, as far as I can see, the Arabs have solidarity in the ITU, so there is some understanding at least at that level. They also face a poverty challenge. If there was a sort of balance and the rich would take care of the poor, the region could have good prospects.
The rest of Africa is even poorer, I guess. When you talked about the divide between the mostly rich and developed north and the developing south, the same goes for Africa, am I correct?
Well, the mostly Arab African north is poor compared to the Middle Eastern nations, to the Gulf states, but at the same time it's rich when compared to sub-Saharan Africa. For some reason people like to refer to Africa as a young continent, an emerging power, when it's actually a very old continent with a rich history. Some of the greatest empires on the planet formed there. It's just that we have this Eurocentrism in terms of politics and geopolitics. We tend to treat Africa as an afterthought. I think Africa's problems have to do mostly with neo-colonialism. During the Soviet period, these issues were addressed one way or another. To me, as a Soviet person, and then a Russian one, it's clear what the underlying problem is. I remember there was once a vote in the ITU, and then I needed to get some votes out of the African countries. We had to win their support. It turned out that a significant number of African ministers, deputy ministers, and the establishment in general had graduated from Soviet schools, like the Odessa Institute of Communications, the Moscow Institute of Communications, the Bonch-Bruevich Institute of Communications. There is such a strong love for Russia there, and memories of the Soviet Union as something that helped them throughout their lives, like raising the local intellectual class, etc. At the same time, neo-colonialism still persists. It no longer has to do with empires in the classical sense, like in the 20th century, but with transnational corporations that tend to view Africa as a market, as an opportunity to appropriate land, mineral resources and so on. They are struggling to fight back. Africa has a way out. I don't want to give unsolicited advice, but Africa does have a way out. It has the resources. The rest comes down to the people who will engage in ICT projects, drive scientific development, etc. The problem is that under neo-colonialism, resources are constantly being sucked out. Educated people are tempted to leave for Europe or America, to developed countries. The day this problem is solved, the day the educated classes, in fact anyone who gets as little as an engineering degree, don't immediately leave, say Burkina Faso for France, but actually stay on and work in their home country, a lot of issues would be resolved that day. The ITU has a strong programme, especially in the development sector. We are constantly funding programmes for equal access, broadband internet access, educational programmes and so on. Even still, this is not enough because Africa has to consolidate, and it will probably consolidate around regional leaders. Currently, these are South Africa and Nigeria as the economic leaders. This kind of regional consolidation in Africa could probably allow Africa to make some serious headway. You might have noticed that I keep bringing up regionalisation. I believe that globalisation is not over and done yet. I think it's still on the agenda. At the very least, we want the internet to survive. We don't want it to, there is a term for it, internet balkanisation. Like when China has its own great firewall, then we maybe put our own firewall. The Americans say we shouldn't have access to Facebook or YouTube. But globalization is possible through regionalization, and major breakthroughs will be made possible in the 21st century, with large regional clusters contributing to the global agenda. Africa is a prime example in this regard.
If you take the whole UN family, all of its constituent bodies, would you describe the ITU as more of a stagnating organization, or rather one of the more advanced? Are you planning to reform it?
As I have already stated in my policy document, and that's an official statement, the ITU is a unique organisation, unlike other organisations. Elections are held every 4 years at the Plenipotentiary Conference. 5 elected positions are voted for, the 3 Bureau Directors, Radio Communications, Development and Standardisation, and Deputy Secretary General and Secretary General. All of these are elected for 4 years. Usually, if a person has done well enough, he is elected for a second term, so it's 8 years. However, often an official starts moving up the ranks, up to Deputy Secretary General, etc., and he ends up serving more than just 2 terms. My suggestion, which does not concern the people who are currently elected, or those who will be elected at the upcoming Plenipotentiary Conference, is that we should not allow an elected individual to stay in an elected office for more than 2 terms. Basically, one would be able to serve 2 terms, and then he would have to move on, like I did, to the private sector or to do science, and then after 4 years he can come back to make his bid for an elected position again. I wouldn't say that the ITU is a rigid body, but if you look at other organisations that specialise in ICT, and I'm not talking about UN bodies like the European Telecommunications Institute, ETSI, ICANN, GSMA, I'd say they are much more dynamic. Even in terms of age groups. But in the case of the ITU, there have been very few people recently that came to join the organisation from the outside. There was a lot of bureaucracy involved. You start in the lowest staff position and go up the ranks, all the way up to the director. After that, you can try your hand at taking an elected office. This is not always a bad thing, because it is essential that the candidate understands what the ITU is all about on the inside. But this kind of rigidity has made the ITU somewhat sluggish in terms of decision making, in terms of reacting to innovation, developing new technologies, like Internet of Things, big data, 5G, etc. All of these technologies emerged outside the ITU, although the ITU has a tremendous R&D potential. Also, when you get elected so many times in a row, there is a certain bias involved. In the 160-year history of the ITU, France had held elected offices 10 times, the US 4 times, Switzerland 9 times. You know which countries I'm talking about. Only 24 countries had their candidates elected for top positions. Russia held the office only once, Mali and Tunisia as well. Out of these 24 countries, 4 or 5 essentially dominated in terms of elected positions. The ITU has always been a fairly Eurocentric and American-centric organisation. It isn't easy to try and turn the tables, so to speak, in order to let the representatives of the other 169 countries even have a chance of getting elected. The rapid turnover we propose would help the organisation achieve that. For instance, we've never had a Brazilian representative. Brazil is a huge country with a population of 200 million people. India, I believe, has only been at the helm once, or maybe not at all. And these are all major powers I'm talking about. Sometimes you need to have a smaller state get in and bring their local perspective, their cultural vision to reform the organisation, and of course age is also an important factor. In this regard, I would like to say that myself and Russia, which I represent, when we proposed limiting the number of terms in office to 2, we wanted to show that we are not in it for selfish reasons. Say you become Secretary General, you serve your 2 terms and then you've got nowhere else to grow. That's why I said in my programme statement that I'm ready to serve for 4 years, and that's it. I will serve 1 term and then after 4 years outside the organisation, I may go in for another 4 years. That is, Russia is ready to give up its position, its candidates. It's so much easier to get elected for a 2nd term. We wanted to show the world that this is something very important to us. Besides, I think we should have the people who have worked in the ITU for a long time set up in a kind of council of elders to advise the Secretary General. On the one hand, you have people serving for multiple terms in a row. But on the other hand, when people leave, we suddenly find ourselves losing a lot of skilled and experienced people. People who have the knowledge of all of our past work. So that's that.
Mr. Ismailov, thank you so much for the interview and good luck.
Thank you very much. It's not going to be easy, but we will do our best.